3 military attack dogs, 14 days of silence, aggression, and handlers who couldn't get within 10 feet without drawing blood. 2 specialists flown in from Fort Bragg, 1 behaviorist with a government clearance. All of them failed. Then a 31-year-old ER nurse in civilian scrubs walked through the gate at Iron Ridge Military Medical Center, and every single dog stopped moving at the same time. Not because she commanded them, not because she had a weapon or a treat or some kind of trick. They stopped because they recognized her, the way animals recognize something that has walked through fire and come out the other side still breathing. Nobody in that compound understood what they were seeing, but the dogs did. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. The call came in on a Wednesday morning, which was already a bad sign. Emily Carter had been awake since 4:30, not because her shift started at 6, but because sleep had become a negotiation she usually lost. 3 years out of the Army and her body still hadn't figured out that the war was over. She'd lie in the dark, listening to the specific silence of her apartment in Redstone City, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car on the street below, and her nervous system would keep running its old calculations anyway. Threat assessment, exit routes. Who else is in the building? She'd stopped fighting it. She made coffee instead. She was on her second cup when the call came through, routed to her cell from Iron Ridge's administrative line. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. A staff coordinator named Paulson, who explained in careful, abbreviated language that the base had a situation with its military working dog unit and that her name had come up through a referral chain he wasn't at liberty to discuss. "What kind of situation?" Emily asked. "The dogs won't work, 3 of them. They've been in behavioral lockdown for nearly 2 weeks. And you're calling an ER nurse." A pause. "You were recommended, Ms. Carter." She didn't correct him on the title. She'd stopped doing that too. She told him she'd be there by 8. But Iron Ridge Military Medical Center sat on the northeastern edge of the city, pressed against a low ridge of hills that turned purple in the early morning light. It was a functioning military facility, not enormous, but serious, the kind of place where the parking lot had clearly defined zones and everyone walking through it had somewhere specific to be. Emily pulled her 10-year-old Civic into the visitor section and sat for a moment before getting out. She recognized the feeling in her chest. Not quite anxiety, more like the particular alertness of a place where the rules were known but not yet negotiated. She got out of the car and adjusted her badge lanyard, her hospital ID from Callaway Regional, where she worked 4 shifts a week in the emergency department, and walked toward the main gate. The MP at the entrance looked at her badge and then looked at her, in that order, which told her everything about how this was going to go. "Emily Carter," she said. "I was called in for a consultation." He checked his clipboard, found her name, looked at the badge again. "Someone will escort you in." The someone turned out to be a young corporal named Hewitt, who had the specific energy of a person who'd been assigned a task he didn't entirely understand. He walked her through 2 security checkpoints without much conversation, and then deposited her outside a low concrete building near the facility's eastern perimeter, where a woman in a security captain's uniform was waiting with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had already made up her mind. Captain Olivia Mercer was maybe 40, compact and direct, with close-cropped dark hair and the posture of someone who'd spent years making rooms straighten up when she walked in. She looked at Emily the way people sometimes did, taking inventory, arriving at conclusions, the civilian clothes under the lanyard, the hospital badge, the fact that Emily was, objectively, younger than the problem she'd allegedly been brought in to solve. "You're Carter," Mercer said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "You work at Callaway Regional." "ER, yes." Mercer nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she'd suspected. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "I don't know who made this call or why, but we have military handlers here. We have specialists from the veterinary corps, and we had a behavioral consultant flown in from out of state 3 days ago. None of them could stabilize these animals. I'm not sure what a civilian ER nurse is going to offer that they didn't." Emily looked at her for a moment. "Then let me do what nurses do." "Which is what?" Assess the situation before I have an opinion about it. Mercer studied her. Something flickered. Not respect, not yet, but the small recalibration of someone who'd expected a different kind of pushback. 5 minutes, she said. You can observe from outside the perimeter. You don't go near the kennels. You don't interact with the animals. Understood. But the kennel facility was separated from the main building by a chain-link corridor and 2 sets of keyed gates. Emily could smell it before she saw it. Not filth exactly, but the compressed, layered scent of animals under stress. Ammonia and something underneath it that was harder to name. Something old and wound tight. There were 3 dogs in the isolation section, a Belgian Malinois in the first run, a German Shepherd in the second, another Malinois at the far end, pacing the length of its enclosure with the mechanical repetition of an animal that had been doing the same thing for so long it no longer knew how to stop. 2 handlers stood outside the perimeter, talking in low voices and not making eye contact with the animals. A third was reviewing something on a clipboard near the gate. Nobody looked comfortable. Emily stood at the outer fence and watched. The shepherd was withdrawn, lying flat, muzzle on its paws, breathing too shallow. The first Malinois was alert, tracking movement, but not lunging. Under different circumstances, you might have called it calm. You'd have been wrong. It was the pacing dog that held her attention. She watched the pattern. 12 feet down, pivot, 12 feet back. Pivot. The rhythm was precise, almost metronomic, and in that precision was the thing nobody had apparently clocked. It wasn't random anxiety. The dog was cycling through something, some repeated sequence of stimulus and response, over and over, like a skipping record. The pivot point at the far end of the run, the dog's head dropped every single time, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second before it turned. Emily said very quietly, "What's at the north end of that run?" Hewitt, still standing nearby, looked over. "What?" "The far end. The end where the dog turns. What's on the other side of that wall?" He frowned. "That backs up to the old supply corridor. It's been closed for, I don't know, maybe a year. Does it have ventilation, air circulation from outside?" He looked genuinely uncertain. "Probably. I don't know the exact layout." Emily watched the dog pivot again. Head drop, turn, resume. She said, "There's a sound coming through that wall, or a smell, something that resets the cycle every time he reaches that end." Hewitt stared at her. Then he looked at the dog, then back at her. "How do you... the handlers have been watching these dogs for 2 weeks." "They've been watching for danger," Emily said. "That's different." Behind her, she heard Mercer's footsteps approach. "Time's up," Mercer said. "I hope you got something useful from that, because..." And then the pacing Malinois stopped. Not gradually, not as part of some natural pause in the cycle. It stopped the way things stop when something external changes. Abrupt, total, the kind of cessation that makes you hold your breath because you're not sure what comes next. The dog had turned toward the fence, toward where Emily was standing. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't cowering. It was looking at her with the particular directness of an animal that has just recognized something it wasn't expecting to find. The other 2 dogs had also gone still. Mercer, to her credit, didn't say anything for a moment. She just watched. Then, "That's luck." Emily didn't argue. She'd been in enough places to know when an argument was the wrong tool. "Probably," she said. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "No, Captain. This is a restricted military facility," Mercer said, and the warmth that had briefly been present in her face was gone. "You've had your 5 minutes. I'll pass on whatever observations you have to the veterinary team, and if they find it useful, that's fine. But you don't have clearance for continued access, and I'm not in a position to extend it." She looked at Emily's hospital badge again. "We appreciate you coming out." It was a dismissal. Clean and professional and completely final. Emily nodded. She looked one more time at the pacing Malinois, still watching her from across the distance of 2 fences and a locked gate, and then she turned and walked back toward the visitor entrance. She was almost at the first security checkpoint when she heard rapid footsteps behind her. It was Hewitt, slightly out of breath. "Ma'am, Ms. Carter, Captain Mercer wants you to wait." Emily stopped. "For what?" "I don't..." They're asking you to wait, inside the first checkpoint. He looked almost apologetic. Something came through on the line. She waited for 11 minutes in a small room with plastic chairs and a water dispenser and a motivational poster about teamwork that had gone slightly crooked at some point and never been straightened. She drank a cup of water and looked at the poster and thought about the pacing dog. When Mercer came in, she was carrying a manila folder, and the expression on her face had changed. It wasn't softened exactly, more like rearranged, like someone who'd expected to play one game and found out mid-move that the board was completely different. "Sit down," Mercer said. Emily sat. Mercer opened the folder on the table between them. Emily could see her own name at the top of the first page. Her name, a series of identification numbers, and a classification header that she recognized. "These came through about 8 minutes ago," Mercer said. "I asked my CO where you were referred from, and he gave me a name, and that name led to a file request, and this is what came back." She tapped the folder. "Why wasn't this in your initial referral?" Emily looked at the documents without reaching for them. "I didn't put it in." "Your service record." Mercer's voice was careful now, the way people's voices got when they realized they'd been operating with incomplete information. "You spent 6 years in the Army as a combat medic, attached to military working dog units for 3 of those years, 2 overseas deployments. You were involved in handler training, trauma conditioning, and MWD rehabilitation in active combat environments." She paused. "You have a rating in K9 behavioral intervention that most veterinary specialists don't." Emily said, "I also have a nursing license and a Tuesday through Friday schedule at Callaway Regional." Mercer looked at her. "Why didn't you say any of this when you came in?" "You didn't ask. You made an assessment based on the badge." The silence between them had a specific texture, not quite uncomfortable, more like the feeling after a bell rings and the sound is still in the air. "The veterinary consultant we brought in is good," Mercer said finally, "but he hasn't been able to stabilize them in 14 days. We're 4 days from the point where the commanding officer is going to have to make a decision about these animals." She didn't elaborate on what the decision would be. She didn't need to. Emily understood. "What do you need?" Mercer asked. It sounded like it cost her something to say it. "Full access to the kennel area. Handler schedules from the past 3 months. The incident reports from when each dog first showed behavioral change. Not the summaries, the raw reports." Emily paused. "And I need the handlers out of the space while I'm working." Mercer's jaw tightened. "These animals are dangerous." "I know they are," Emily said. "I still need the handlers out." Another pause, then Mercer closed the folder. "I need to make a call, Deb." The call took 40 minutes. Emily waited in the same plastic chair and didn't check her phone, because there was nothing on her phone that was more important than what was happening in this room. When Mercer came back, she had a different bearing. Something had shifted in the chain of command above her, and Emily could see the residue of it in the set of Mercer's shoulders. "You've been granted temporary access," Mercer said. 24 hours, with conditions. You'll be accompanied at all times by an armed handler outside the perimeter. You document everything. If any animal escalates to active aggression, you step back and let us respond." She set a laminated temporary pass on the table. "And you tell me right now if there's anything else in your service record I should know about." Emily picked up the pass. "I was good at my job," she said. "That's all." Mercer almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. "Get changed. You're not going into that kennel in scrubs." They gave her a utility uniform, olive green, with no rank insignia. It fit well enough. She laced up the boots they'd found, half a size too big, but she'd worked in worse, and pulled her hair back and stood in front of the mirror in the locker room for a moment. She looked more like herself than she had in a while. The first handler she met at the kennel entrance was a staff sergeant named Burkett, a heavy-set man in his late 30s with careful eyes and the specific posture of someone who'd been dealing with a problem long enough that his confidence in his own judgment had started to erode. "You're the civilian," he said. "Nurse," she said, "and before that, something else." He glanced at her temporary pass, and some of the skepticism retreated. The dogs have been unpredictable all week. Rex, he gestured toward the pacing Malinois, took a piece out of Hendrik's arm 4 days ago. We've had to keep entry teams outside the perimeter. What was the last operation they ran before this started? Burkett frowned. Training exercise, simulated building breach, 6 hours, high-stress scenario, nothing out of the ordinary. Who ran the scenario? Lieutenant Garst. He's been the primary command handler for the K9 unit for the past 7 months. Emily filed this. What commands does Garst use for tactical deployment? Burkett started listing them. He'd gotten 3 in when Emily stopped him. What's the verbal cue he uses for the hold command? Burkett repeated it. Emily was quiet for a moment. That's not a hold command, she said. Burkett stared at her. What? The phoneme sequence, the way it's structured, in the conditioning framework these dogs were trained under, that phrasing is half a step away from a release cue. If Garst has been using it consistently in high-stress contexts, he's been sending these dogs a mixed signal every time they hit peak arousal. She looked at the pacing Malinois, who had resumed its circuit but slower now, still occasionally flicking its gaze toward her. They're not broken. They've been systematically confused at the moment of highest stress over and over for 7 months. What you're seeing isn't aggression. It's a system that's been trying to make sense of contradictory instructions and finally stopped being able to. The silence from Burkett was a different quality than the silence from Mercer. This one was the silence of a man who was thinking back through everything he'd witnessed for the past 2 weeks and finding a new explanation for all of it. Garst doesn't know, Burkett said finally. It wasn't a defense. It sounded almost like grief. No, Emily said. I don't think he does. She went in. Not all at once. Not with bravado or the kind of practiced performative calm that Emily had seen some handlers use. The false relaxed posture, the wide smile. Animals notice the difference between calm and performed calm the way people notice the difference between a genuine apology and a rehearsed one. She stood at the inner gate for 3 minutes before opening it, letting the dogs register her presence. Not staring them down, not avoiding their gaze, just existing in their awareness at a distance that didn't demand anything. The armed handler, a young specialist named Okafor, stood outside the perimeter with his hand near his sidearm and his eyes moving between Emily and the dogs with the hypervigilance of someone trying to calculate response times. Emily opened the gate and stepped into the outer corridor. Rex, the pacing Malinois, stopped walking. His focus was total. Not threatening, not submissive. He was reading her the way trained animals read people. Not faces, but something underneath faces. The microsignals that people didn't know they were sending, the quality of their breathing, the specific way their weight shifted, the thing underneath the performed calm. Whatever it was, true or false. Emily let him read. She said very quietly, in a specific pattern, not a command, not quite, but a cadence she'd learned in a concrete building in a country that looked nothing like this one. In a year she didn't talk about at dinner parties. She said something low and rhythmic and present. Rex's head dropped. Not in threat, not in submission. In the specific way that an animal drops its head when it has been carrying something and is told, in a language it trusts, that it can set it down. He took 3 steps toward her and stopped. Outside the perimeter, Okafor had gone completely still. Emily crouched down, slow, no sudden angles, and stayed there at his level, not reaching out, not speaking, just present, just breathing. Rex took the final 2 steps and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. For a moment, the whole kennel complex was absolutely silent. Then from somewhere behind her, she heard Mercer's voice, tight, controlled, working to stay that way. What is she doing? Burkett answered, equally quiet. I have no idea. But that wasn't true. Emily could hear in Burkett's voice that he had some idea now, some new understanding of what he'd been watching for 14 days and what it actually meant. Rex pressed harder against her shoulder. His whole body had changed. Not the coiled, misread tension of the last 2 weeks, but something looser, something that knew it was allowed to be uncertain and wasn't going to be punished for it. The other 2 dogs were watching. Emily stayed crouched and thought about what came next. The rehabilitation wasn't finished. It was barely started, and the work ahead would be methodical and unglamorous and require more than one afternoon. But this moment mattered. What happened in the next few minutes would set the frame for everything that followed. She reached up, very slowly, and placed one hand on Rex's neck. His muscles were still tight. 14 days of sustained stress didn't release in 5 minutes, but under her hand she could feel him deciding something, arriving at something. She thought about the closed supply corridor behind the north wall. She thought about Garst's command phrasing and the 7 months of accumulated confusion. She thought about the 2 dogs still watching from their enclosures, waiting to see what Rex decided so they could decide the same thing. She thought about the file in Mercer's folder with the classification header. 3 years of her life compressed into paperwork, sealed in a drawer somewhere, irrelevant until the moment it wasn't. She thought about the way Mercer had said you're just a nurse without actually saying it, the way it lived in her tone, in the 5-minute limit, in the crossed arms at the facility entrance. Emily had spent 3 years getting used to being something they thought they understood. She was done explaining herself to that particular assumption. She kept her hand on Rex's neck and let him keep deciding, and through the chain link and the perimeter fence, she could see Mercer watching her with an expression that had moved well past rearranged and into something closer to the specific discomfort of a person who has been completely wrong about something in front of witnesses. The German shepherd in the second enclosure had lain down. The other Malinois had stopped pacing. All 3 dogs, for the first time in 14 days, were calm. And somewhere in the administrative wing of Iron Ridge Military Medical Center, Emily knew, without having been in the room, that a second conversation was already happening. A conversation about the sealed file, about what it meant, about who had called whom and why Emily Carter's name had appeared on a referral list in the first place. The question of whether she belonged here had already been settled by 3 animals who trusted things that couldn't be faked. The question of what happened next was going to take a little longer. Rex exhaled, a long, slow breath, and the tension in his neck, millimeter by millimeter, began to release. Emily stayed where she was and kept her hand steady and waited, the way she'd learned to wait in the army, in the specific patient discipline of someone who understood that the most important moments were almost never the loud ones. Outside the perimeter, Okafor had lowered his hand from his sidearm. Inside the wire, everything was very still. In the administrative wing, a phone was ringing. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked it up. Emily didn't hear the conversation. She was still inside the perimeter, still crouched beside Rex with her hand on his neck. But she knew from the way Mercer moved that whatever was being said on that line was changing the shape of the afternoon. The captain paced a short distance away from the fence, one hand pressed to her ear, her free hand making the controlled gestures of someone trying to stay composed while receiving information they hadn't expected. Rex made a low sound. Not a growl, more like an exhale with an edge to it, the sound of an animal that had been holding its breath for 2 weeks and was only now beginning to understand it was allowed to stop. "Easy," Emily said. Not a command, just a sound. The word didn't matter as much as the rhythm. She stayed low and kept her breathing even and watched, through her peripheral vision, as Mercer ended the call and walked back to the perimeter fence with a new kind of deliberateness in her step. Not anger. Not quite. Something more complicated than that. The specific forward motion of a person who has been handed a problem they didn't create and now have to manage in front of an audience. Burkett was still beside the fence. He'd barely moved in the last 15 minutes. His clipboard was hanging loose at his side, forgotten. "Sergeant," Mercer said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words in real time. "Pull the handler rotation logs from the last 3 months. All of them. Not the summaries, the originals." Burkett looked at her. "All the way back to January?" "I said 3 months." He went. Mercer turned to look at Emily, still crouched in the corridor with Rex pressed against her shoulder. "We need to talk," Mercer said. "I know," Emily said. "Give me 10 more minutes." Mercer looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she looked at Rex, the dog that had taken a piece out of a handler's arm 4 days ago, now leaning into a civilian woman like he was trying to remember what it felt like to trust something. And she didn't argue. She waited. Oh. The 10-minute stretched to 15, but by the end of it, Emily had moved methodically to each enclosure, spending time at the outer edge of each dog's space, without pushing, without demanding, without the kind of aggressive patience that was its own kind of pressure. The German shepherd, his tag read Kilo, watched her from across his run with wide, uncertain eyes for the first 3 minutes, and then very slowly got to his feet and walked to the fence line. He didn't press against it, but he stopped pacing and stood there, and that was something. The second Malinois, a younger dog named Dax, was harder. He was carrying more reactive energy than the other two. The 14 days had metabolized differently in him, turned into something with sharper edges. He watched Emily from the back corner of his enclosure with the tight-wound attention of an animal that wanted to approach and had been burned enough times to second-guess the wanting. Emily crouched at his fence line and stayed there without moving. Okafor outside the perimeter shifted his weight. "He's the one we're most worried about," he said quietly. "He hasn't let anyone approach the fence in 5 days." Emily said nothing. She stayed crouched. Dax watched her. After about 4 minutes, he took one step forward. Emily exhaled slowly. He stopped, processed, took another step, then another. He was 3 feet from the fence now, close enough that she could see the white of his eye, the stress indicator, that half-moon of sclera, and she was watching it slowly, incrementally, reduce. He didn't come to the fence, but he stopped running from it. That was enough for now. She stood carefully and moved back toward the outer gate, and when she stepped through it and let it lock behind her, she could feel the change in her own body, the specific decompression of exiting a high-stakes space, the way your muscles remember they don't have to be ready anymore. Okafor was looking at her with an expression he was working to keep professional. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," she said. Then, "Thank you for staying steady in there." He blinked, like the acknowledgement was unexpected. Yeah, of course." Mercer was already walking toward her. They went to a conference room in the administrative wing, just the two of them. It had the standard institutional furniture, a table that had been scratched by 1,000 briefings, chairs that didn't quite match, a whiteboard with old marker residue that hadn't fully erased. Mercer set a legal pad on the table, but didn't sit right away. She stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the facility grounds, and Emily could see her working through something. Finally, Mercer sat down. She didn't open the legal pad. "The call I received," she said, "was from Colonel Haskell's office. He's the regional commanding officer. He was the one who authorized your referral." A pause. "Apparently he knows your former unit commander, from overseas. Apparently there was a conversation about these dogs that I wasn't part of." Emily said, "How long have you known about the referral?" 3 days. I was told a civilian consultant was coming, I was given your name, and I was told your area of expertise was emergency nursing." Mercer looked at her directly. "I was not told about your service record. Did you ask for it?" A beat. "No." The honesty in that landed. Emily appreciated it. "The file was sealed," Emily said. "Not hidden, exactly, but sealed. I requested that when I transitioned out. I had reasons for it." "What reasons?" Emily thought about how to answer that. She'd had this conversation before, in smaller versions, in different rooms, and she'd learned that the full answer never quite fit inside a single conversation. There were parts of her service that she'd folded up and put away. Not because she was ashamed of them, but because they had a weight that was difficult to carry casually, the way you couldn't carry certain equipment without the right training. "When I left the Army," she said finally, "I needed to be something else for a while. The record made it complicated." Mercer studied her. "The record shows commendations. 2 of them." "I know. People generally don't seal commendations." "People generally don't seal them," Emily agreed. "I wasn't particularly interested in being a symbol." Another silence. Mercer picked up her pen and set it down again without writing anything. "The file also shows," Mercer said, "that you were involved in a formal complaint during your last deployment against a superior officer." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. Not from surprise. She'd known this would come up eventually, because it always did, the one piece of her record that sat differently than the rest of it. "Yes." "The complaint was upheld." "Partially." "The officer was reassigned." "Also partially." Emily met Mercer's eyes. He kept his rank. The room was quiet. Outside, through the window, someone was crossing the grounds with a folder, head down, walking fast the way people walked in military facilities when they had somewhere to be. "I'm not going to ask you to go into that," Mercer said. Not kindly, exactly. It wasn't pity, more like a professional decision. She had enough information to recalibrate her opinion, and she was going to do that without needing to turn it into a confession. "What I do need to ask you is what you saw today, and what it's going to take to fix it." Emily leaned forward. "The dogs aren't the problem. The command structure is." She laid it out in plain language without softening it. The phoneme mismatch in Garst's command cadence, the way it had functionally inverted the hold signal over months of repetition in high-stress environments, every deployment scenario, every training exercise, every moment of peak arousal where Garst had used that cue had been rewiring the dog's response mapping, not maliciously, not even negligently in the strictest sense. Garst had been trained on a slightly different framework than the one these particular dogs had been conditioned under. And in the specific gap between those two systems, over 7 months of accumulated sessions, the confusion had compounded until the dogs were operating in a state of permanent low-grade cognitive dissonance. Then came the breach exercise 6 days ago. 6 hours of sustained high-intensity work, Garst's commands running at maximum frequency, and the dogs had finally hit a wall where the contradictory signals couldn't be parsed anymore. They hadn't become dangerous. They'd become overwhelmed. The handlers interpreted the shutdown as aggression, Emily said, because some of the behaviors look similar from the outside, but the internal state is completely different. An aggressive dog has a target. These dogs were just lost. Mercer was writing now. And Hendrick's arm? Rex didn't attack him. Rex was in a reactive state, and Hendricks approached too fast from the wrong angle. Rex responded to the approach pattern, not to Hendricks specifically. Emily paused. "Has Garst been informed of any of this?" "Not yet." Mercer's pen stopped. "Garst has been on administrative leave since the incident. Voluntary. Well, he requested it. He's been pretty shaken up about the situation. He should know it wasn't his fault. Not entirely." Emily considered this. He needs to know what the actual problem was, or he's going to internalize the wrong lesson, and it'll happen again with a different unit. Mercer looked at her for a moment. That's a generous take, given that his error put 3 dogs into behavioral lockdown and 1 handler in medical. "It's an accurate take," Emily said. Generous and accurate sometimes look the same. They brought Burkett in with the rotation logs 20 minutes later. He spread them across the table and stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the accumulated months of scheduling data with the expression of someone confronting something they weren't going to enjoy. Emily went through them. She was looking for the transition point, the exact session where the command drift would have become significant enough to start producing visible behavioral changes. She found it in a cluster of entries from mid-February. 3 consecutive high-intensity sessions, back-to-back, with Garst as primary handler on all 3. "Here," she said, pointing to the dates. "This is where it started accumulating. Before this, you'd have seen minor inconsistencies. After this, it was systematic." Burkett crouched to look at the entries. "We flagged one of those sessions," he said. "Rex was showing some avoidance behavior after the 3rd day. We noted it and scheduled a rest period." "The rest period didn't help," Emily said, "because the issue wasn't fatigue. It was the signal mapping. Resting a dog who's confused about commands doesn't resolve the confusion. It just gives them time to cement the wrong response." Burkett straightened up. He had the look now of a man who'd been doing his job conscientiously and carefully, and had still ended up here, in this conference room, reviewing paperwork that told him the thing he'd missed wasn't obvious until someone stood in exactly the right place to see it. It wasn't a comfortable look, but it was an honest one. "How long to fix it?" he asked. "Depends on the dog. Rex is the most resilient. He came through the conditioning fastest. He'll recalibrate fastest. Probably 3-4 days of focused work. Kilo needs more time, maybe a week. Dax is..." She hesitated, thinking about that one step, then another. "Dax is going to take patience. He's built up a secondary response layer on top of the original confusion. It's going to take longer to get underneath it." We have 4 days before the CO has to make a call, Burkett said. I know. That's not enough time. For a full resolution? No. Emily gathered the logs into a neat pile. But it's enough time to demonstrate stabilization, which is enough time to make the case that these animals have a path back to operational capacity. She looked at him. That's the argument we need to make in 4 days, not that it's finished, that it's possible. Burkett looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the table. I'll need access starting tomorrow morning, Emily said. 6 a.m. I want to be in there before the handler's daily briefing so the dogs don't carry the ambient stress of the routine into our sessions. You'll have it, Mercer said. And I need Garst's full training documentation. Everything he used, every command sequence, the specific phoneme transcriptions if they exist. They might not exist in that format. Then I'll need an hour with Garst. Mercer paused. He's on leave. I understand, but I need the information, and he's the source. Emily stood up from the table. You can frame it however helps. I'm not trying to build a case against him. Mercer looked at her steadily. What are you trying to do? Fix the problem, Emily said. All of it, not just the symptom. She left the facility at 5:30, back in her own clothes, the temporary pass in her jacket pocket. The evening was coming on cool. Redstone City in early spring held on to the cold longer than it should, the kind of weather that made you feel like winter wasn't entirely convinced of its own ending. She sat in the Civic for a few minutes before starting it. She wasn't decompressing exactly, more like letting the day settle into its proper shape. The morning had been one thing, the quiet of her apartment, the coffee, the phone calls she'd expected to be a strange errand and had turned into something else. Now there was Rex with his muzzle against her shoulder, and Mercer's recalibrated expression and Burkett's honest discomfort, and the 4-day clock running somewhere inside the administrative wing, and the sealed file sitting open in someone's hands for the first time in 3 years. She started the car and pulled out of the visitor lot and drove toward the city without the radio on. The next morning she was back at 6, as promised. Okafor was already there, looking like he'd had marginally more sleep than his eyes suggested. He walked her through the second security checkpoint without a word and handed her a fresh temporary pass with a new date. Burkett was waiting at the kennel entrance with a folder. Garst's training documentation, he said. Most of it. There's a gap in March where the formal logs weren't kept properly. I flagged it. He handed her the folder and didn't quite make eye contact. He knows you're here. He asked if he could... Burkett stopped. He wanted to know if you'd tell him what you found. Emily looked at the folder. I'll talk to him when I have something solid enough to be useful, not before. Burkett nodded. Something in his posture loosened slightly, like he'd been dreading a different answer. She went in. The morning session was different from the evening before. Rex was awake and alert, some of the residual stress from the previous day having metabolized during the night, and he tracked her movement from the moment she stepped into the outer corridor with the particular attention of an animal deciding whether to trust a pattern or abandon it. She didn't push toward him. She moved with the specific economy she'd learned years ago. Nothing extra, nothing performative, every movement with a legible purpose. It took 8 minutes for him to come to the fence line. She worked with him for 40 minutes, reintroducing command sequences from the framework he'd originally been trained under, using the correct phoneme structure, building back the association between cue and response without the static of Garst's 6 months of drift. It wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive and patient and careful, and by the end of the session, Rex was responding to 3 basic commands with the clean, direct engagement of a dog who understood what was being asked. Not fixed, not even close to finished. But the signal was getting through. She took a 20-minute break, documented the session responses, and moved to Kilo. Mercer appeared at the perimeter fence at around 10:30. She stood there for a few minutes, watching Emily work with Kilo from outside the corridor, and Emily could feel her presence without looking at it. That specific awareness of being observed by someone who was revising their understanding of you in real time. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the sequence, let Kilo settle, and then stepped back to the fence line. Progress? Mercer asked. Rex is responding. Kilo's getting there. Emily pulled off one glove and flexed her hand. The cold was in the air, and she'd been outside for 4 hours. Dax is still holding back, but he's not retreating when I approach the fence. That's new. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I had a meeting with Colonel Haskell this morning. Emily waited. He's extended your access to 10 days. Mercer said it flatly, like she was reading from a document. Full facility access. No handler accompaniment requirement after today. Your own judgment on when you want support in the perimeter. Emily considered it. That's more latitude than I expected. The Colonel has reviewed your full service record. Mercer paused. Not just the summary, all of it. Another pause, shorter. He wanted me to convey He said to tell you that you should have been brought in on day 1. Emily looked at the fence. He wasn't wrong. No, Mercer said. He wasn't. The silence between them had a different quality than it had the day before. Still not warm, exactly. Mercer wasn't a warm person, or at least not in any obvious way, and Emily had stopped expecting warmth from professional spaces a long time ago. But it was an honest silence, the kind that existed between people who had looked at the same problem from opposite angles and arrived at the same place. There's something else, Mercer said. Emily looked at her. The March gap in Garst's training logs that Burkett flagged. Mercer's voice had changed register. Still controlled, but with something underneath it. I looked into it. The logs weren't kept improperly, they were removed. Emily went still. Someone pulled 3 weeks of training documentation from the physical records room sometime in early April, Mercer continued. The digital copies have also been overwritten. There's a log in the system showing the overwrite, but whoever did it assumed nobody would trace it back. She looked at Emily directly. It wasn't Garst. Who was it? That's what I'm working on. Mercer's jaw was tight. What I can tell you right now is that those 3 weeks correspond exactly to the period where Garst's command drift would have been most obvious and most correctable. If those records had been available to the veterinary consultant, he might have found what you found. Emily processed this. The math wasn't complicated. Someone had pulled the documentation that would have solved this problem early. Before the dogs deteriorated to the point of lockdown, before Hendricks ended up in medical, before a formal evaluation process got triggered. Why? She said. The investigation is open. Mercer's voice was carefully neutral. But I'll tell you what I think, and you didn't hear it from me. Garst was the primary handler. He's also been recommended for a position in the Command Structures Training Division, a promotion, effectively. If his handling errors had been formally documented and addressed in March, that recommendation wouldn't have gone forward. Someone protected him, Emily said. Someone protected the recommendation, Mercer said. Whether they were protecting Garst is a separate question. Emily thought about the 3 dogs in their enclosures. 14 days. Hendrick's arm. The behavioral consultant flown in from out of state who hadn't been able to help because the records he needed to see had been erased. Who made the recommendation for Garst's promotion? She asked. Mercer looked at her for one measured moment. Lieutenant Colonel Voss, she said. He's the head of the K9 training program. Wholesome. She didn't stop working. That was the thing she'd learned, in the Army and after it, that the political gravity of a situation could pull you into it until it consumed all your attention, and while it was consuming your attention, the actual problem was still sitting in a kennel going through its second week of distress. So she kept working. She went back to Dax in the afternoon and spent 90 minutes at the fence line, and by the end of that session the dog had come within 2 feet of the fence and held position there, watching her without retreating. Progress that would have looked like nothing to someone who didn't know where it had started. Burkett was doing the documentation now, keeping careful logs of each session, more careful than Garst's records had been, with timestamps and specific behavioral notations. Emily had asked him for that on day 1, and he'd produced it without complaint, which told her something about him. At 4 o'clock, Okafor appeared at the perimeter with 2 coffees in paper cups and handed one through the fence without being asked. How do you take it? He said. Black is fine. He nodded. They stood and drank coffee on opposite sides of the fence in the afternoon cold, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that sometimes happened in military spaces between people who'd been in proximity to the same stressful thing long enough that the formality wore thin. You were in? he said eventually. 6 years, you? 4. Got out last spring. He looked at the kennel. I worked with dogs for about 8 months back in my last posting. Different unit. You like it? He considered this. I like what they are, he said. What they do. The trust part of it. I didn't like what happened to them when the command structures got screwed up. He paused. Which happened a lot. Emily looked at the kennels. It happens everywhere, she said. That part of it doesn't belong to the military specifically. No, he said. It doesn't. They finished the coffee. Okafor took both cups and dropped them in a waste bin 20 feet away. Voss is here, he said when he came back. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, but his eyes were watchful. Came in through the east entrance about 30 minutes ago. He's in a meeting with Mercer. Emily said nothing. I heard what Mercer found, Okafor said, about the records. He looked at her directly. This base has about 40 people. Information moves. I know. I'm telling you because Voss has been the head of this program for 3 years. He knows everyone and everyone knows him. If Mercer is looking at him, it's going to get complicated, Emily finished. Yeah. Okafor glanced toward the administrative building. You should know what you're in the middle of. Emily appreciated this. Not the information necessarily. She'd already been doing the math, but the fact that he'd said it. There was a kind of professional loyalty that ran underneath military spaces, a current that moved in specific directions, and Okafor was directing it toward her, and that was not nothing. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went back to his post. She was finishing her end-of-day notes when Mercer came to find her. Mercer's face had the particular compression of someone who'd spent the last 2 hours managing something she wasn't going to be able to fully manage. She was holding a folder, a different one than the morning's logs. Thicker. Voss wants a briefing, she said, on your assessment, tonight. Emily looked up from her notes. Tonight. He's framing it as routine oversight. As head of the K9 training program, he has authority to receive status updates on any ongoing evaluation within his division. Which is technically accurate, Mercer confirmed. Her voice carried a specific inflection on that. The sound of someone describing a rule being used for a purpose it was never designed for. What does he actually want? Emily said. Mercer was quiet for one moment. My read? He wants to get in front of this before the investigation identifies what happened to those records. If he's in the room, he controls the narrative. If he can frame your assessment as preliminary or inconclusive, he gives himself room to... She stopped. I shouldn't speculate out loud. No, Emily said. You probably shouldn't. She looked back at her notes. The day's sessions, Rex's response times, Kilo's progress, Dax's 2 feet of ground. When? She said. 6 o'clock. Conference room B. Emily wrote one more notation and closed the folder. She thought about the sealed file, sitting open in Colonel Haskell's office. She thought about the March records, overwritten by someone who'd calculated that nobody would look closely enough to find the trace. She thought about Garst on administrative leave, probably sitting somewhere reviewing every session he'd run and trying to understand what he'd done wrong, while the person who'd built the conditions for that misunderstanding was preparing to walk into a conference room and shape the story. She thought about Rex's exhale, that long, slow release of 2 weeks of held breath. Tell him I'll be there, she said. Mercer looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, the beginning of an alliance. Do you want me in that room? Emily stood up from the table. She was tired, the kind of tired that came from sustained precision, from being careful for 8 hours straight, from maintaining the specific quality of presence that the dogs required. Her back ached from crouching. Yes, she said. Bring Burkett, too. Mercer nodded once. And the original handler incident report, Emily added. The unedited one from when Hendricks was hurt, not the summary, the raw report. Something shifted in Mercer's expression, a small thing, almost imperceptible. You've already figured out what's in it. I have a hypothesis, Emily said. I want to verify it before I walk into that room. Mercer pulled the thick folder from under her arm and held it out. Emily took it. She opened it to the first page and read the incident report header. The date, the time, the responding personnel, and in the notation field where an incident supervisor's sign-off was required, a name. Lieutenant Colonel Voss. He'd been present for the incident. He'd signed off on the report. And in the field where the supervisor was required to document any observed command errors that may have contributed to the incident, the box was blank, not incomplete, not marked as pending, blank. Emily closed the folder and held it in both hands and looked at the far wall of the kennel corridor, where the cold evening air was just beginning to come in through the gaps. In 6 hours, she was going to walk into a room with the man who had let 3 dogs and 1 handler pay the price for a cover-up he'd built to protect a career trajectory that wasn't his to protect. She was going to walk in there with her notes and her temporary pass and her hospital badge and her unsealed file. And she was going to say what she'd found, clearly and specifically, in front of witnesses. She'd done harder things. The conference room door swung open at the other end of the corridor, and through it, at a distance, she could see a figure in a lieutenant colonel's uniform crossing the administrative wing. He moved with the ease of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. He hadn't looked toward the kennels yet. He would. She had 45 minutes before the meeting. She used them. Back at the kennel, in the last thin light of the afternoon, she pulled out her session notes and cross-referenced them against Garst's training documentation, looking for the specific entries that would show the command drift in sequence, not as an interpretation, not as a theory, but as a documented progression across identifiable dates. If Voss was going to walk into that conference room and reframe her assessment as preliminary, she needed the timeline to be airtight. Numbers, dates, behavioral notations in Burkett's handwriting, time-stamped and specific. The kind of record that was difficult to argue with in front of witnesses. She found what she needed in 40 minutes and spent the last 5 writing 3 sentences that summarized it in language that left no room for interpretation. Then she closed her notes and walked to conference room B. Voss was already there. He was sitting at the head of the table, not the side, not the middle, the head, the position that declared something before a word had been spoken. He was in his late 40s, with the particular grooming of someone who understood that authority was partly performed, and he was reviewing documents when Emily came in, which she clocked as deliberate. The papers in front of him were incidental. The posture was the message. He looked up when she entered and gave her the specific smile of someone who had decided in advance to be gracious about this. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I've heard good things about your work these past 2 days." Mercer came in behind Emily. Burkett behind her with a folder under his arm. Voss's eyes tracked them. The smile held, but something underneath it recalculated. "Captain." He nodded at Mercer. "I appreciate you facilitating this." He gestured at the chairs, not the ones closest to him, the ones on the opposite side of the table. The arrangement was not accidental. Emily sat where she wanted to sit, which was 3 chairs down from Voss on his side of the table, close enough that he'd have to turn to address her directly. Mercer took the seat across. Burkett placed himself near the door with his folder and said nothing. Voss looked at Emily's new position for a fraction of a second and then redirected. "I wanted to check in personally," he said. "The K9 unit is a priority asset, and I like to stay close to any significant evaluation. Can you give me a status summary?" Emily set her notes on the table. Rex and Kilo are showing measurable stabilization. Dax is further behind, but the progress from yesterday to today suggests a viable path. She paused. "I can walk you through the specific session data if that's useful." "Please." She did. She was clear and precise, and she used Burkett's time-stamped notations as her baseline, citing entries specifically: date, time, behavioral indicator, response to intervention. It was the kind of presentation that didn't need embellishment because the data carried itself. When she finished, Voss nodded. "Encouraging," he said. "Though of course it's still early. The full rehabilitation timeline. The full timeline is 10 to 14 days for all 3 dogs," Emily said. "I've already communicated that to Captain Mercer and confirmed it with the Colonel's office." A pause. Small, but there. "Colonel Haskell has been kept in the loop," Voss said. Not a question, not quite. He's been briefed daily, Mercer said. Her voice was flat and professional and gave nothing away. Voss turned a page in his own folder. I also wanted to address the question of Lieutenant Garst's training documentation. I understand there's been some concern about the completeness of the records. There's been an investigation opened, Mercer said, into the March records specifically. Right. Voss closed his folder, a composed gesture, the kind that was meant to signal that whatever was about to be said was settled and untroubling. I want to get ahead of any confusion there. Those records were temporarily relocated during our spring compliance audit. Standard procedure. We cycle physical documentation into central review on a rotating basis. I can provide the audit schedule if that would help. The room was quiet. Emily looked at him. He was good. The explanation was coherent, the delivery was smooth, and he'd used the word confusion twice in 4 sentences, which was a technique she recognized, but the preemptive framing of someone else's accurate observation as a misunderstanding. The digital copies were also overwritten, Emily said. Voss looked at her. System migration. The IT team can confirm. During a compliance audit. Correct. She held his gaze for one moment and then looked down at her notes and made a notation on the bottom of the page that was, in fact, meaningless. She was writing a date and a dash and nothing after it, but the act of writing it, calmly, in his field of vision, while he watched, had a specific function. It told him that she was keeping a record of this conversation. His jaw shifted very slightly. My concern, Emily said, without looking up from the notes, is that the missing documentation corresponds precisely to the period where the command drift in Garst's technique was most correctable. If the veterinary consultant had access to those records, he would likely have identified the issue before the dogs reached behavioral lockdown. She set down her pen. I'm not making an accusation. I'm establishing the clinical sequence. Voss was quiet for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was a long time in a room like this. The veterinary consultant's approach differed from yours, he said finally. It's possible he would have reached a different conclusion regardless of what the record showed. It's possible, Emily said. It's also possible I can demonstrate the connection directly, using session-by-session documentation going back to January. She tapped Burkett's folder without opening it. The drift is trackable. It has a start point, a progression, and a terminus. The gap in March is in the middle of that sequence. Voss looked at the folder, then at Mercer, then back at Emily. The graciousness was still on his face, but it was load-bearing now, the way a wall was load-bearing. You could see it working. This is a preliminary assessment, he said. I want to make sure we're characterizing it correctly for the Colonel's office. Until the rehabilitation is complete, the Colonel's office has already received my preliminary report, Emily said, as of this afternoon. Another pause. Longer this time. Mercer said nothing. Burkett said nothing. Emily looked at Voss and waited. I see, Voss said. He closed his own folder. He straightened it against the table edge with both hands, a composed gesture, the kind of thing people did when they needed to do something with their hands and didn't want it to look like they needed to do something with their hands. Then I think we're in good shape, he said. Keep up the good work, Ms. Carter. I'll let you get back to it. He stood first. That told her he needed to. Eat. He was gone within 4 minutes of leaving the conference room. She could see him through the corridor window, crossing the grounds toward the east parking area, moving with purpose. She watched him go. He's going to make calls tonight, Mercer said from behind her. I know. The audit explanation is going to have documentation behind it by morning, real-looking documentation. Probably. Emily turned from the window. It won't hold if Haskell's people look at the metadata on the overwrite. Mercer studied her. You already told Haskell's people to look at the metadata. I suggested it would be informative. Mercer was quiet for a moment, then, You've done this before. It wasn't a question, so Emily didn't answer it as one. She picked up her notes from the table. I need to be back in the kennels at 6 a.m. Is that still confirmed? It's confirmed. Then I'll see you tomorrow. She meant it as a close, but Mercer spoke again before she reached the door. Carter. The first time she'd used Emily's last name without a preceding Ms. The shift was small and deliberate. The incident report, with Voss's signature on it and the blank supervisor notation. Yes. That goes into Haskell's next briefing package. Emily looked at her. I know. I'm going to make sure of it personally. Emily nodded once. She understood what Mercer was telling her. Not just that the report would be included, but that Mercer had made a decision about which side of this she was standing on. That was its own kind of courage, in a facility where Voss had been in authority for 3 years and knew everyone and everyone knew him. Thank you, Emily said. She meant it. But Day 3. The morning session with Rex was the best yet. He was responding to 7 command sequences now, clean and direct, without the hesitation that had marked the first day's work. Emily ran him through the basic framework 3 times in succession, and he tracked every transition without error, his whole body language different from the wound-tight animal she'd approached across 2 fences 48 hours ago. Still some residual wariness that didn't disappear in 3 days, and she wasn't asking it to. But the confusion was clearing. The signal was getting through. Burkett watched the session from outside the perimeter. When she came out, he handed her the coffee without being asked this time. Haskell's JAG officer was here at 7 this morning, he said. Before you got in. Emily looked at him over the cup. For what? Don't know the specifics. They were in Mercer's office for about an hour. He paused. Voss called the facility at 0600. Mercer didn't take the call. Emily drank the coffee and thought about that for a moment. Mercer not taking the call was a statement. In a command structure like this one, a captain not taking a call from a lieutenant colonel required a specific kind of conviction, the kind that came from having already committed to a position and calculated the cost. She's going to take heat for this, Emily said. Yeah. Burkett looked at the kennel. She knows. The morning moved forward. Kilo's session showed real progress. He was making eye contact now, holding position when asked, his body language carrying the specific relaxation of an animal that had started to rebuild trust in the command sequence. Emily documented everything, time-stamped and precise. It was during the mid-morning break, while she was reviewing her notes outside the perimeter, that Okafor came to find her. He wasn't in his usual post position. He was moving with a specific kind of contained urgency, the walk of someone who had information and was managing how fast they delivered it. There's a situation, he said. Emily put down her pen. Which kind? Dax. He glanced at the kennel. He got into an altercation with the cleaning crew about 20 minutes ago. Before your session, they went in to do the morning sanitation on his enclosure and he went for the fence. Bit through the chain link in one section. Emily felt the specific cold of that settling in. How far did he get through? Didn't break out, but the chain link is compromised in that section, and Dax has been pacing the perimeter since the crew left. Okafor looked at her directly. Burkett's recommending we call the vet corps in for a sedation assessment. She was already moving. The kennel corridor felt different when she got there. Dax was not the dog she'd left at the end of yesterday's session. 2 feet from the fence, watching her, something tentative beginning to build. That version of Dax was gone. What was in the enclosure now was all compressed reactive energy. The dog pacing the perimeter in a tight circuit, his head low, his movement different from Rex's old cycling pattern. This wasn't confusion. This was arousal, genuine threat mode arousal, the kind that didn't respond to the same techniques. She assessed the compromised section of chain link. Dax had gone through the lower third with what looked like 3 or 4 bites. Not an escape attempt exactly, more like the expression of an animal that needed something to break. The fence was bent inward, not breached, but bent. When did the cleaning crew enter, she said. 0740, Burkett said behind her. Who authorized morning sanitation during active behavioral rehabilitation? A silence. It's standard schedule, Burkett said carefully. Standard schedule for a dog that's been in behavioral lockdown for 2 weeks, Emily said. Not for one that's in active rehab. The protocol should have been modified. She kept her voice even. This wasn't the moment to assign blame. The dog was still in front of her, and the fence was still bent, and the sedation team was apparently on standby somewhere in the administrative wing. Did anyone communicate the modified protocol to the cleaning crew? Another silence. Longer. No, Burkett said. Emily exhaled through her nose and looked at Dax. He was at the far end of the enclosure, pivot point, head dropping, and she saw it now in a new light, the same dropping gesture she'd clocked on day one, except now she understood exactly what was on the other side of that wall and why it mattered. The supply corridor, air circulation, whatever was coming through that gap. Is there anything in that supply corridor, she said? Anything that would have been moved, disturbed, anything with a scent that could have changed in the last 24 hours? Okafor pulled out his radio before she finished the sentence. The answer came back in 3 minutes. The supply corridor had been accessed by a maintenance crew yesterday afternoon, cleared out for an upcoming facilities inspection. Old equipment moved out, some solvent used for cleaning. The scent load through that wall would have changed dramatically overnight. He's been cycling on that scent all morning, Emily said. Then the cleaning crew came in and he had 2 simultaneous disturbances he couldn't parse. She looked at the bent fence. He didn't try to get out. He was trying to make it stop. Burkett was quiet. Okafor was quiet. The radio crackled with something distant and irrelevant. Tell the sedation team to stand by, Emily said, not to approach. Carter, Burkett started. I'm going in. That fence is compromised. If he gets through that section, he's not trying to get out, she said. He's trying to communicate. There's a difference. She looked at Burkett. Document this. Everything from 0740 forward, exact timeline. He opened his folder. She put on her gloves and unlatched the outer gate. Inside the perimeter, Dax was at the far end of his circuit, head dropping at the pivot, and she could feel the changed quality of the air, tension that was different from the kennel's usual stress, sharper, with an edge that made the back of her neck prickle. She was aware of everything. The bent chain link, the distance to the outer gate, Okafor's position outside the perimeter with his hand near his sidearm. She stood at the inner gate and didn't open it yet. Dax completed his circuit and hit the near end and saw her. He stopped. They looked at each other across 10 feet of concrete and steel. In the army, there had been a dog, a Malinois named something she couldn't say in any format that would translate here, named in a language she'd learned 4 words of over 2 deployments. And that dog had been through a building breach that went wrong, a situation that had produced in the animal the same compressed, cornered energy she was looking at right now. She'd spent 6 hours with that dog on a concrete floor in a forward operating base, 6 hours of exactly this: presence, patience, the specific discipline of not needing the outcome to happen on her schedule. She didn't know if this was going to work. That was the part nobody talked about, the part that lived underneath the technique and the training and the service record, the simple, unglamorous fact that sometimes you did everything right and the situation didn't care. She opened the inner gate. Dax's whole body went rigid. She stopped moving. She was inside the corridor now, with the gate behind her, and Dax was 8 feet away and every muscle in his body was making a decision. She could see it, the conflict visible in his posture, the same animal that had taken 2 steps toward her yesterday, fighting against 3 weeks of accumulated disturbance and 1 terrible morning. She crouched down. She said the cadence. Low, rhythmic, the specific pattern from his original conditioning framework, the one Garst's months of drift had buried but hadn't erased, because conditioning that deep didn't erase, it just got covered. Dax's ears moved. She said it again. He took 1 step toward her, stopped. His breathing was audible from 8 feet away, fast, shallow, the respiratory pattern of an animal running on adrenaline. She stayed crouched and said the cadence again and waited. He took another step, then another, and then he lunged. Not at her, past her, toward the bent section of fence, the compromised chain link, and he hit it hard, hard enough that the bent section gave 3 more inches and the entire fence structure vibrated. And Emily was already moving, not away toward him, into the space between him and the fence, putting herself there before she'd fully processed the decision. Higher! The command came out of her in a language she hadn't spoken in 3 years, from a framework she hadn't consciously accessed since her last deployment. Not a request, not the gentle therapeutic cadence. The command, direct, clean, with the specific authority of something spoken from the part of you that doesn't negotiate. Dax hit the end of his momentum and turned. He was 2 feet from her. His chest was heaving, His eyes were wide. Emily stayed exactly where she was. She could hear, from outside the perimeter, Okafor's sharp intake of breath. She could hear Burkett's radio crackling as someone somewhere was probably being told to mobilize. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was elevated but not panicked, running on the specific clarity that came from being inside a situation where there was no useful calculation left to make. Only presence or absence. Only this moment or the one that came after it. Dax stood 2 feet from her and breathed. She breathed. And then, from somewhere in the administrative wing, a door slammed open. Hard, the kind of slam that had urgency behind it. And voices carried across the compound, and one of them was raised in a way that cut through the ambient noise of the facility like something sharp through something soft. She recognized the voice. It was Mercer's, and it was not controlled, and that told her everything she needed to know about what had just happened inside. Dax flinched at the sound. Emily put her hand on his neck. "Lots," she said quietly. He folded. He went down onto the concrete floor and lay flat and pressed his muzzle against the ground. And his breathing was still fast, but his body had surrendered the tension. And Emily kept her hand on him and looked through the fence and the perimeter and the distance to the administrative wing, where Mercer was now standing in the doorway with a face that had gone beyond professional composure into something rawer and more immediate. Their eyes met across the compound. Mercer held up a single sheet of paper. Emily couldn't read it from this distance. She didn't need to. Whatever was on that paper had changed things again, shifted the weight of the next 4 days into a completely new configuration. And from the look on Mercer's face, it was not the kind of change that came with warning. She stayed on the floor of the enclosure with her hand on Dax for another 4 minutes before she moved. Not because she needed the 4 minutes, because he did. His breathing had slowed from the sharp, rapid cycling of an animal in crisis to something closer to functional. Not calm, not yet, but no longer running the red line numbers that had put him through that fence. She could feel the difference under her palm. The way muscle tension was a language if you knew how to read it, and she'd been reading it for long enough that she didn't need to think about it anymore. It happened below the level of thought, like the way a person who'd learned to drive a long time ago didn't think about the clutch. When she stood, she did it slowly and without announcement, and Dax stayed flat on the concrete, watching her with eyes that were still wide but no longer desperate. She latched the inner gate behind her, then the outer. She stripped off her gloves and walked across the compound toward Mercer. Up close, the paper Mercer was holding was a single printed page with a header Emily recognized as a JAG document format. Legal office, official record. Mercer's hand was steady, but her jaw was tight in the specific way of someone who had received information they'd been expecting and found it worse than anticipated anyway. "Voss filed a formal objection this morning," Mercer said, "to your continued access. He's citing conflict of interest. Claims your preliminary report to Haskell's office constitutes unauthorized prejudgment of an ongoing investigation." She handed Emily the page. "He's also filed a secondary complaint against me for failing to maintain proper chain of command and communications with the Colonel's office." Emily read the document. It was well constructed. Whoever had drafted it, whether Voss or someone he'd called at 6 a.m, had used the language correctly, cited the right regulations, built a procedural argument that was technically coherent even if its intent was transparent. "He moved fast," she said. "He moved scared," Mercer said. "Which is faster?" Emily handed the document back. "What does Haskell's office say?" "That's why I came out. Haskell's JAG officer called me 20 minutes ago. The Colonel wants a formal briefing. Not a status update, a briefing, with full documentation." Mercer paused. "Today, 1400 hours. Emily looked at her watch. It was 10:53. "Can you be ready?" Mercer asked. "I've been ready since the conference room last night," Emily said. "I need Burkett's logs, the incident report, the January through April command session records, and the IT metadata analysis on the March overwrite." "The metadata analysis came back an hour ago," Mercer said. "That's the other thing. The overwrite timestamp is 14 March, 03:17 in the morning." Emily looked at her. 3 in the morning, Mercer said. "Nobody runs a compliance audit at 3 in the morning. The IT officer who analyzed it says the overwrite was manually executed from a terminal in the K9 program administrative office." She paused. Voss has key access to that office. Who else does? 3 other people. All of them were off base on March 14th. I've already verified the gate logs. The morning air was cold and flat and very clear. In the kennel behind them, Dax had gotten to his feet and was standing at the far end of his enclosure, not pacing, just standing. Something in his posture was different from an hour ago. Not recovered, but repositioned, the way a person looked after a crisis passed and left them standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out what came next. Emily understood the feeling. "Get me everything," she said. "I'll be ready at 13:30. Sam." She spent the next 2 hours at the table in the corridor outside the kennels, going through the documentation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the way you lost these situations was not usually by being wrong, it was by being right and unprepared. The materials were all there: Burkett's time-stamped session logs, the raw incident report with Voss's signature and the blank notation field, the January training record showing Garst's command drift beginning to build, the IT analysis with its damning 317 timestamp. Separately, each piece was circumstantial. Together, they built something that had no reasonable alternative explanation. She arranged them in sequence on the table, worked out the presentation order, and then rewrote her summary notes twice until the language was precise enough to be unassailable and plain enough that it wouldn't need interpreting. Burkett brought her a sandwich at 12:30 that she mostly didn't eat. "How are the dogs?" she asked. Rex had a good morning session with Okafor. Just observation, the way you said. Kilos settled. Dax, he paused. Dax is quiet. I don't know if that's good quiet or bad quiet. It's processing quiet, she said. Don't disturb him this afternoon. No cleaning crew, no maintenance access, nothing that changes the scent load in or around his enclosure. Already told them. She looked at him. He'd been careful and consistent since day one. Kept the records, asked the right questions, didn't make the job harder. In a situation where the command structure was compromised, that kind of reliability mattered more than it usually got credit for. You're going to be asked about the morning sanitation failure, she said, in the briefing. Haskell will want to know who made the call to send the cleaning crew in without modifying the protocol. Burkett was quiet for a moment. I should have caught it. I saw the schedule and I didn't flag it. Did you have written access to the behavioral rehabilitation protocol I filed on day one? He stopped. I had a verbal summary. I don't think the written protocol came to me directly. It didn't, Emily said. It went to Mercer's office. Standard routing would have put it to the facility operations lead before it came down to individual crew scheduling. It didn't get there. Burkett processed this. That's a routing failure, It's a documentation failure at the administrative level, Emily said. Note it accurately. Don't take responsibility for something that wasn't in your lane. She picked up the sandwich and ate a section of it. And don't lie about any of it. Haskell's people are going to be thorough. He nodded slowly, like he was writing this down without a pen. One more thing, she said. When Voss came to the facility last night, before the conference room meeting, did you see him in the kennel area at any point? Burkett frowned. No, he came in through the east entrance and went straight to the administrative wing. Did anyone escort him? Corporal Hewitt was on entry duty. He'd have logged the escort. Emily filed this and finished the sandwich. The briefing room was larger than Conference Room B, an actual briefing room with a long table and a projector and chairs along 3 walls for personnel who were there to observe rather than participate. When Emily arrived at 13:45, there were 7 people already seated, and she recognized 3 of them. Mercer at the side wall with a folder on her knees. Burkett near the door. Okafor in the observer section, which surprised her briefly before she understood it. He'd been on perimeter duty for all 3 days. He'd watched the sessions. He was a witness in the technical sense. The 4 people she didn't recognize included a woman in a JAG officer's uniform seated at the table with a recording device in front of her, a man in civilian clothes who had the specific bearing of someone from an inspector general's office, and 2 senior officers seated at the far end who she placed by their insignia as a full colonel and a major. Colonel Haskell was not there yet. He came in at 1400 exactly. He was 60-something, with a lean economy of movement and the kind of stillness that came from having run enough serious rooms that he'd stopped needing to assert himself in any visible way. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the assembled group and then at Emily, directly. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I appreciate you being here." "Thank you for the access, sir," she said. He nodded once and looked at the JAG officer. "We're recording. Begin." The briefing took 1 hour and 20 minutes. Emily presented first, working through the documentation in the order she'd prepared. The command drift analysis, the behavioral session logs, the clinical sequence from the dog's training history to the lockdown event. She was precise and she was direct, and she did not editorialize. The data did what data did when it was well organized. It accumulated, it connected, it became undeniable. She could feel the room's attention shift in the first 15 minutes, from the polite wait-and-see attention of people who weren't sure what they were looking at into the sharper, forward-leaning attention of people who were now sure. When she reached the section on the March documentation gap, the civilian from the IG's office leaned forward. "Walk me through the IT analysis," he said. She walked him through it. Timestamp, terminal location, key access records, gate logs placing the other authorized users off base. The sequence was simple and the conclusion it pointed to was singular. "Can the timestamp be spoofed?" the colonel asked. The IT officer's analysis addressed that, Emily said. The server log shows an active session, not a scheduled or automated process. Someone was at that terminal. The colonel looked at the JAG officer. Something passed between them that Emily didn't try to read. It was above her grade level, and it wasn't her job to manage it. Mercer presented the incident report next. She held the blank supervisor notation field up to the room and stated, without inflection, that according to facility protocol, a supervisor present during an incident involving handler injury was required to document any observed contributing factors, and that the field being blank on a report that Voss had signed constituted a formal reporting failure. The major at the far end of the table wrote something. The IG officer was very still and very attentive. Then came the moment Emily had been waiting for, not with anticipation exactly, more with the specific readiness of someone who knew the terrain was about to change. The colonel looked at the JAG officer and said, "Bring him in." Voss came through the door looking like a man who had spent the last 2 hours constructing his composure brick by brick. He was in full uniform, his bearing correct, his expression arranged into something that was meant to convey professional concern. He looked at the room and didn't react visibly to what he saw, which was itself a reaction. He sat at the table across from the JAG officer. "Lieutenant Colonel Voss," the colonel said, "thank you for coming." "Of course, sir." His voice was even. "I want to give you an opportunity to address the documentation findings directly." Haskell gestured to the JAG officer, who slid a printed copy of the IT analysis across the table. Voss looked at it. Emily watched him read the timestamp, the terminal location, the key access notation. His eyes moved across the page with the careful speed of someone doing arithmetic. "This was addressed last night," he said. "The compliance audit explanation has been reviewed," the colonel said. "The audit schedule you referenced was filed this morning. The audit itself has no corresponding record in the system prior to this morning." Voss looked up from the document. "The system migration documentation you referenced," the colonel continued, "also has no record prior to this morning." The room was very quiet. Voss straightened the document in front of him, the same composed gesture from the night before, and Emily knew he was doing the calculation. The real-time assessment of what was recoverable and what wasn't. She'd watched people do this calculation before. There was a moment in it, usually brief, where the person was still deciding which version of themselves to be. "I want to consult with legal counsel before I continue," Voss said. "You're entitled to that," the colonel said. "This briefing will be paused to allow that consultation." He looked at the JAG officer. "Note the time." She noted it. "However," the colonel said, and his voice didn't change register, but something in it did, some quality of finality that didn't need volume. "I want to be clear about what happens next, regardless of that consultation. Effective immediately, your authorization over the K9 training program is suspended pending investigation. Access to program facilities, records, and personnel is revoked. You will be escorted from this facility by the end of business today. Voss didn't move. The formal investigation will address the March documentation, the incident report notation, and your filing of this morning's objection in the context of the evidence now on record. Haskell looked at him steadily. That filing will be reviewed as a potential obstruction action. Emily watched Voss's hands on the table. They were flat, still, controlled, but the skin around his knuckles had gone slightly pale. The dogs, he said, and his voice was different now, not quite stripped of the professional composure, but with something underneath it showing through, like a structure with its cladding removed. The 3 dogs, whatever you think of my decisions, the dogs were always the priority. Nobody in the room said anything. Emily looked at him across the table. She thought about 14 days. She thought about Hendricks in medical. She thought about Dax going through the fence that morning. She said, "They are now." He was escorted out at 15:40. She saw it from the corridor window. Not deliberately, she'd been walking back toward the kennels, and he was crossing the grounds in front of her, flanked by 2 MPs in the specific walking formation of an escort that wasn't technically a detention, but was structured like one. His car was in the east lot. He walked to it without looking at the facility, without looking at the kennel building. She kept walking toward the kennels. The afternoon session with Rex was 90 minutes. She ran him through 10 command sequences, then spent 40 minutes on free response work, letting him make choices, rewarding the right ones, building back the confidence that came from a dog understanding that its own judgment was trustworthy. By the end, he was working with a quality of engagement she hadn't seen yet, present, direct, self-assured, the difference between an animal that was complying and one that was participating. When she brought him back to his enclosure, he sat at the entrance and looked at her for a moment before going in, not waiting for permission, just taking a beat, the way a person might pause at a doorway. She understood the impulse. Kilo's evening session was shorter, 30 minutes, consolidating the morning's progress, not pushing for new territory. He needed consistency more than expansion right now, and she gave him that. Dax she left alone. Not because she'd given up on him, the opposite. The morning had shown her that he needed the afternoon to process, the same way people sometimes needed silence after something that had taken a lot out of them. She stood at the outer fence for 10 minutes, close enough that he could register her presence without being required to interact with it, and that was all. He watched her from the middle of his enclosure, not from the corner, the middle. That was new. Mercer found her at the end of the day, in the corridor with her notes. She looked different from the morning. Not relaxed. Mercer wasn't someone who relaxed visibly, but with the specific settled quality of someone who had done something difficult and found it was survivable. Haskell's office called, she said. Garst has been contacted. They're bringing him in tomorrow for a debrief. Does he know about the command drift? I told him this afternoon. Not the full technical explanation. I said there was a finding that cleared him of primary responsibility for the dog's condition. She paused. He cried. Emily set down her pen. He's been on leave for 10 days thinking he broke 3 dogs and put a handler in medical, Mercer said. He's 29 years old. Emily thought about Garst, a face she'd never seen, a person she knew only through documentation and other people's descriptions. 29. Primary handler, 7 months of careful, dedicated work that had been systematically undermined by a structural gap that nobody had told him existed, and then 10 days of carrying the weight of what he thought he'd done. He should come to tomorrow's session, Emily said. Observe, don't participate. Let him see where the dogs actually are. That can be arranged. And tell him, she stopped, organized the thought. Tell him the dogs don't hold it against him. That's not how it works for them. They don't do retrospective blame. They're just ready for the next thing to make sense. Mercer wrote this down. She actually wrote it down, which was unexpected and somehow, in that moment, exactly right. Day 4 started differently. The rhythm of the facility had shifted overnight. The compound had the specific texture of a place where something significant had happened, and people were still processing the edges of it. There were conversations in corridors that stopped when Emily walked past, not from hostility, but from the specific uncertainty of people recalibrating what they knew. She recognized this texture too. She'd walked through it before, in different buildings in different countries, and the feeling was always the same. The moment after a structure changes shape, and everyone is figuring out how to stand in it. She went to Dax first. He was up when she arrived, standing at the center of his enclosure, and he tracked her approach from the outer fence with wide, alert eyes. Still reactive, the baseline reactivity would take longer to fade than 3 days of progress could fix. But when she got to the fence line and crouched down, he took 2 steps toward her without stopping. Then 2 more. Then he came all the way to the fence and pressed his nose through the gap. She put her hand up and let him smell it. He sniffed for a long time, working through whatever information lived in her skin: the kennel, the coffee, the compound's specific combination of metal, an antiseptic, and outdoor air, and then he exhaled. Not Rex's long 2 weeks released exhale. Something shorter and more provisional. A beginning. She opened the outer gate. She worked with him for an hour, inside the outer corridor, not pushing into his enclosure, letting him control the approach. He tested everything: her body language, her cadence, her stillness, the space between her stillness and movement. She let him test it. She answered every test the same way, which was no way at all, just presence, just consistency. By the end of the hour, he had responded to 2 commands. She documented them and felt something that was not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction implied it was finished, and it wasn't, but something adjacent to it. The particular sensation of watching something move from the edge back toward the center. Garst arrived at 10. She saw him from across the compound, a young man in civilian clothes, dark circles under his eyes, and the specific stiffness of someone who hadn't been sleeping well, being walked toward the kennel area by Burkett. He was looking at the facility like he was seeing it after an absence that had lasted longer than 10 days, like the distance between who he'd been when he left and who he was now had stretched the geography of the place. Burkett brought him to the outer fence and stopped there. Emily came out of the kennel corridor and looked at him. He was pale, and his handshake, when she offered it, was the handshake of someone who was holding themselves together by a margin they weren't confident in. "I read the documentation," he said, "the command drift analysis." His voice was careful, like he was managing it. "I've been going over it since Captain Mercer called. I keep trying to find the point where I should have caught it." "You couldn't have caught it," Emily said, "not without knowing the difference between the 2 frameworks. That's a training gap, not a judgment gap." He looked at her for a moment, then at the kennels. "Can I see them?" She walked him to the perimeter. Rex was in his enclosure, alert, and turned toward them. When he saw Garst, he came to the fence line without hesitation. Not the avoidance and reactive tension of the past 14 days, but forward and present, the straightforward interest of an animal that recognizes someone it knows. Garst made a sound that was quiet and involuntary and not quite controlled. "He's not angry at you," Emily said. "That's not what was happening. He was confused. He's not confused anymore." Garst's hand went to the fence. Rex pressed against it from the other side. Emily watched this and didn't say anything else. Because there was nothing else to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Kilo showed the same response. Dax, from the far end of his enclosure, watched Garst with cautious eyes, but didn't retreat. "He's going to take a while longer," Emily said, "but he's getting there." Garst was quiet for a long time. When he finally turned to her, his face had the specific wrecked quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for 10 days and had just been told they could put it down, but their muscles hadn't gotten the message yet. "Thank you," he said. "I mean, that's not—" He stopped. "I don't know how to say what I actually mean." "You don't have to," Emily said. The formal disciplinary proceedings against Voss were filed mid-afternoon, and the news moved through the facility at the speed that news always moved in military installations, fast, specific, and without editorial comment. Emily heard it from Okafor at the end of his shift, standing by the outer fence in the early evening light. "Formal charges," Okafor said. "Falsification of official records, dereliction of duty, obstruction of a command investigation." He paused. "There are apparently 2 other incidents in his record they are now looking at. An equipment requisition irregularity from 18 months ago, and a prior incident report from a different unit that also had a blank notation field. He did it before, Emily said. Looks like. Okafor leaned against the fence post. The K9 training program directorship has been put under interim oversight. Regional Command is reviewing all the program evaluations from the past 3 years. Emily thought about 3 years. She thought about how many training cycles that was. How many handlers, how many dogs. That's going to take a while, she said. Yeah. He looked at her sideways. Mercer's been put forward for an interim lead role on the program review. Emily absorbed this. She's good, Okafor said. She is, Emily agreed. The evening was getting cold again, the kind of cold that came down off the ridge in the late afternoon and settled into the compound like it was staying. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked at the kennel building and thought about Dax, who was in there working through his processing quiet, and Rex, who had pressed against Garth's hand at the fence, and Kilo, who was consistent and steady and somewhere in the middle of finding his way back. She had 6 more days of authorized access. That was enough time. Probably. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang. Not the facility line, her personal cell, which almost nobody called during work hours. She looked at the screen. It was Callaway Regional, the ER. She picked up. Carter. The voice on the other end was the charge nurse, a woman named Pritchard, whom Emily had worked with for 3 years, and what she said in the next 40 seconds was delivered in the flat, factual tone of someone delivering information they knew was going to change the next 24 hours of someone else's life. When she hung up, Okafor was watching her. "Everything okay?" he said. Emily looked at the compound, the kennel building, the administrative wing, the corridor windows where Mercer's office light was still on, the ridge behind the facility turning dark against the sky. "There was an incident at the hospital," she said. "A patient. Someone is asking for me specifically." She paused, organizing it. "It's complicated." "Do you need to go?" She thought about Dax. 6 days of authorized access. Mercer's evening briefing in 40 minutes. She thought about what Pritchard had told her, the thing that was waiting at Callaway Regional, the specific kind of complicated that didn't wait. "Yes," she said. She was already moving toward the parking lot when Okafor called after her. "Carter." She turned. "The name they gave," he said. "The patient. Pritchard told you a name, right?" "Yes." "Was it Hendricks?" The question landed. She looked at him across the compound. Okafor's face was readable now in a way it hadn't been before. The watchful professional exterior had dropped just enough to show something underneath it, something that had the particular weight of information that had been carried quietly and was now in the open. "You know something," she said. "I heard something this morning," he said carefully, before Voss was escorted out. He made a phone call from the East Corridor. He paused. "I wasn't close enough to hear the content, but I heard him use that name." The evening air was cold and very still. Hendricks was in medical. Had been since the incident with Rex 4 days before Emily arrived. The bite, the hospital intake, the 10 days of recovery that had been running in the background of everything else. Voss had made a phone call with that name in it, 40 minutes before he was walked off the base. Emily stood at the edge of the parking lot and looked at Okafor and understood that the thing she'd thought was reaching its conclusion was not, in fact, concluded. And that what was waiting for her at Callaway Regional was not separate from what had happened in this compound over the past 4 days, but was the same story, running in a direction she hadn't anticipated, coming back around. She drove fast but not recklessly, which was a discipline she'd learned a long time ago. The difference between urgency and panic was mostly a matter of keeping your hands steady on the wheel. Callaway Regional was 22 minutes from Iron Ridge on a normal evening. She made it in 16, parked crooked in the staff lot, and was through the ER entrance before the automatic doors had fully opened. Pritchard was at the nursing station. She was a 53-year-old woman who had worked emergency medicine for 27 years and had the specific economy of movement that came from spending decades in spaces where every second had a cost. She looked at Emily when she came through the door and handed her a tablet without preamble. "Room 7, she said. "He's been stable for the last 40 minutes, but he was agitated when he came in. He asked for you by name, not the department, you specifically." Emily looked at the tablet, the intake information, patient name, Hendricks, DJ, age 26. Admitted 2 hours ago from Iron Ridge Military Medical Center via transfer, with a secondary presentation of elevated cortisol markers, blood pressure spiking in ranges inconsistent with his recovery from the bite injury and what the transferring physician had charted in careful language as apparent psychological distress with potential external stressor involvement. She handed the tablet back and went to room 7. Hendricks was sitting up in the bed, which told her the physical situation was not the crisis. He was a young man, younger looking than 26, with a right forearm wrapped in a clean dressing and the particular expression of someone who had been frightened into a specific kind of clarity. He looked at her when she came in, and some of the tension in his shoulders dropped. "You're Carter," he said. "I am." She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. "What happened?" He glanced at the door. She understood the glance. It was the glance of someone who had been afraid of being overheard, and she got up and closed it. When she sat back down, he talked. It came out in the slightly disorganized sequence of someone who had been holding something for days and was releasing it all at once, not quite in order. She let him go without interrupting, tracking the thread. The incident with Rex, the bite, the medical intake at Iron Ridge, had been logged as a standard handler injury. Occupational hazard, animal response during behavioral assessment, no fault attributed. Hendricks had been told to rest, keep the dressing changed, come back in a week for evaluation. What he hadn't been told, until 2 days ago, was that Voss had called him. Not officially, personally. Voss had his cell number from the unit contact list, and the call had come in at 9 in the evening 2 days ago. And what Voss had said, in the measured collegial tone of a senior officer being helpful, was that he wanted to make sure Hendricks understood the official account of the incident, that Rex had been in behavioral distress, that the bite was an unpredictable animal response, and that no command errors had contributed to the circumstances. "He told me to confirm that if anyone asked," Hendricks said. "He called it aligning the record. He said it was in the interest of the unit." Emily looked at him steadily. "He called me again today," Hendricks said, "this afternoon. Right after—" He stopped. "Someone texted me that he'd been walked off the base, and then he called, and his voice was different. He wasn't— The collegial thing was gone. He said the investigation was politically motivated. He said if I'd already confirmed the account to anyone, I needed to stick with it." Hendricks looked at his bandaged arm. "I told him I hadn't talked to anyone, but I had. The JAG officer came to see me yesterday." Emily was quiet for a moment, letting the shape of it settle. Voss walked off the base at 1540, had made a phone call from the East Corridor before he left, Okafor's account, and then had made a second call to Hendricks from somewhere outside the facility after the escort, trying to shore up whatever account he'd already started building. "What did you tell the JAG officer?" she asked. "What happened?" Hendricks said. "Exactly what happened. Rex wasn't in a random behavioral state when I approached. Garst had run a command sequence about 3 minutes before I went in, and Rex had been in a stress response since then. I saw it. I documented it in my personal log, which I didn't submit because—" He stopped again. "Because I was new to the unit, and Voss had already signed off on the official report, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it." "Do you still have the personal log?" "It's on my phone." Emily looked at him. He was 26, and he'd been sitting with this for 10 days, carrying the weight of something he'd seen clearly and been quietly told to set aside. And the physical symptom presentation that had brought him to Callaway Regional tonight, the blood pressure, the cortisol markers, the distress, was not a mystery. It was what happened to people who held contradictions in their bodies long enough. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. He exhaled. "I didn't know where else to go. And you were the only person I'd heard was actually—" He searched for the word. "Trying to fix it, not manage it. Fix it." She stayed with him for another 15 minutes, made sure the nursing team had the updated context for his care, and then stepped out into the corridor and called Mercer. Mercer answered on the second ring. Emily told her about Hendricks, about both calls from Voss, the one before the escort and the one after, made from outside the facility, to a potential witness in an active investigation. She told her about the personal log on Hendrick's phone. When she finished, the silence on Mercer's end lasted about 4 seconds. "He called a witness," Mercer said, "after being formally suspended. From outside the gate, after his access was revoked." "That's obstruction," Mercer said. "Not potential, actual." She was moving already. Emily could hear it in the background sounds, the door, the quick step. "I'm calling the JAG officer. Hendricks needs to submit that phone log tonight." "He's ready to," Emily said. "He came here because he was ready. He just needed someone to confirm he wasn't going to get buried for it." A pause. "Tell him he won't." "I already did." "Tell him it came from me." Emily went back to room 7 and told Hendricks. He nodded, and the particular quality of the nod, the steadiness in it, the decision that had already been made and was now just being confirmed, reminded her of Dax pressing his nose through the fence gap that morning. The movement of something that had been waiting for a signal it could trust. She was back at Iron Ridge by 9:30. The facility was quieter at night, the compound lit by the periodic pools of outdoor lighting, the administrative wing showing only a few windows still illuminated. Mercer's was one of them. Emily went to the kennels first, not because there was anything clinical to do at 9:30. The dogs needed rest, not another session. She went because it had been a long day, and she needed the specific grounding of being in a space where things were what they were, without subtext, without calculation, without the particular exhaustion of navigating human institutions that had decided to eat themselves. She stood at the outer fence in the dark and listened. Inside the kennel building, she could hear breathing. 3 separate rhythms, distinct, each one telling her something. Rex's steady and unhurried, Kilo's slightly slower, the deep sleep of an animal finally getting real rest. And Dax, quieter than the other two but present, a sound that was lighter than before, something that was working its way toward the same place the others had already reached. She stood there for a while. She thought about what Hendricks had said. "You were the only person I'd heard was actually trying to fix it." And she thought about how strange it was, the way credibility worked. She'd walked through this facility's front gate 3 days ago with a hospital badge and a temporary pass, been given 5 minutes and a politely pointed exit, and now she was standing in the dark outside the kennel building at 9:30 at night, while a formal investigation moved through the administrative wing and a former lieutenant colonel tried to reconstruct his position from the wrong side of a closed gate. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She'd looked at what was actually in front of her instead of what she'd been told to expect. She'd brought the right information into the right room. She'd stayed in the corridor with Dax when it was easier to step back. The ordinary things, done carefully, in the right sequence. That was usually what it was. The formal investigation conclusion came 9 days later. Voss was charged with 3 counts of falsifying official records, 1 count of dereliction of duty, and 2 counts of obstruction. The second call to Hendricks, made after his suspension and from outside the facility, had been the cleanest piece of evidence in the file. His legal counsel had apparently advised him that the IT metadata, combined with Hendricks' phone log and the gate records, left no viable defense on the falsification charges. He entered a negotiated plea on the first day of formal proceedings. He was stripped of his rank, removed from the program permanently, prohibited from holding any supervisory role in military animal programs. The 2 prior incidents that had emerged during the investigation, the equipment irregularity and the other incident report with the blank notation, were added to his formal record. Emily was not in the room when this happened. She was in Dax's enclosure. She heard about it from Burkett, who came to the kennel fence with the specific energy of someone delivering news they'd been waiting to deliver. He read her the key findings from his phone in the flat, factual tone he'd been using for documentation all week, and she listened and nodded and looked at Dax, who was beside her now, so fully inside the enclosure, lying 3 feet away, watching the interaction with calm, attentive eyes. 10 days ago, that dog went through a fence, Burkett said, looking at Dax. He did, Emily said. Burkett was quiet for a moment. I've been in this unit for 6 years. I've never seen a rehabilitation move this fast. He wasn't broken, Emily said. He was waiting for something to make sense. Burkett looked at her in the way people sometimes looked at her, like she'd said something that sounded simple but wasn't, and they were trying to figure out where the depth was. She wasn't trying to be obscure. It was just accurate. Garst came back. Not to his full handler role immediately. That would take retraining, recertification, a proper reintegration protocol that Emily had outlined in a formal recommendation to Haskell's office. But he came back to the facility, and on the 7th day of Emily's access period, he ran a supervised session with Rex using the corrected command framework under her observation. Rex worked like the professional he was. Clean responses, direct engagement, no hesitation. He moved with the animal confidence of a dog that knew exactly what was being asked of him and exactly what came next. Garst was crying before the session was half over, not stopping, still running the commands, still present, still doing the work, but with his face wet and his voice steady, because he was 29 and he'd spent 3 weeks thinking he'd done something irreparable, and he was standing in front of evidence that he hadn't. Emily watched from outside the perimeter and didn't interrupt. After the session, Garst came to where she was standing. "I'm going to do the retraining," he said. "The full recertification. I want to understand both frameworks." "I know you will," she said. "How do you know?" She looked at Rex, trotting back to his enclosure with the loose, easy stride of an animal at home in itself. "Because you came back," she said. "A lot of people wouldn't have." On the 9th day, Mercer came to the kennel in the morning with a formal document from Haskell's office. It was a letter of commendation. Emily's name at the top, a summary of her contributions, a formal notation that her assessment and rehabilitation work had been incorporated into a regional review of K9 training protocols. Signed by the Colonel. Mercer held it out. Emily took it and read it. "There's also this," Mercer said. She produced a second document. "Haskell's office is requesting that your rehabilitation methodology be submitted for formal review as a supplemental training module. The K9 program, once the review is complete, would integrate it into handler certification." She paused. "It would have your name on it." Emily looked at the second document. She thought about the sealed file, the 6 years she'd folded up and put in a drawer because she'd needed to be something else for a while, because the weight of what those years contained was easier to carry when she wasn't also being asked to display it. The hospital badge, the 4 shifts a week, the specific quiet of a civilian life that had its own value, its own demands, its own version of what mattered. She thought about walking through Iron Ridge's front gate with a temporary pass and being given 5 minutes. "Tell the Colonel I'm honored by the commendation," she said, "and that I'll submit the methodology for review." Mercer took the second document back. Then she said, in a voice that had dropped the last of its professional formality, "I made an error with you. At the gate, on day 1. Emily looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend I would have known without the file," Mercer said. "But I made an assessment based on what I expected to see and I stopped looking. That's on me." "It is," Emily said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Mercer accepted this. She didn't apologize again or try to diminish it with context. She just absorbed it, which was the right thing to do. "You're good at this," Mercer said. "Both things. The ER and this. People who are good at one thing are rare. People who are good at 2 are rarer." Emily folded the commendation letter. "I had good teachers," she said, "and bad situations. Between the 2, I learned what I needed to." On the last day of her authorized access, she spent the morning doing what she'd been doing for 10 days, working through the session protocols, running each dog through their command frameworks, documenting the responses. It was the same work it had always been, repetitive, careful, patient, unglamorous. The kind of work that didn't photograph well but was the actual substance of everything that had changed. Rex was full operational spec. She wrote that in her final report without hesitation. Clean command response across all sequences, behavioral stability under simulated stress conditions, handler ready. He'd get his formal reevaluation from the veterinary corps, but she knew what they were going to find. Kilo was close. Another week of consolidation, and he'd be there. Dax was the longest road, and she'd known that from the morning he'd gone through the fence, but he was on the road. His final session with her was 40 minutes of focused work, and at the end of it he sat beside her in the corridor with his flank pressed against her leg, and his breathing steady, and that was a thing that had not existed 10 days ago and was real now, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it mattered. She wrote the continuation protocol for Dax in precise, careful language, specific to his behavioral profile, his response patterns, the command sequences that were working, and the triggers to avoid. Whoever picked up his rehabilitation from here would have a map. It wouldn't be her, but it would be enough. She finished the paperwork at 2 in the afternoon. Burkett walked her out. Not officially, not an escort, just a person walking across the compound with another person, the way you did when something had been shared and the ending of it deserved acknowledgement, even if neither party was especially comfortable with ceremonies. At the main gate, he stopped. Sergeant Marcus Doyle is taking interim command of the K9 unit while Mercer does the program review, he said. He wanted me to pass something on. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He wrote it down because he said he'd mess it up if he said it in person. She took the paper and unfolded it. Ms. Carter, I've been in this unit 9 years. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see with these animals. I hadn't. What you did in 10 days with 3 dogs that everyone else was ready to give up on changed the way I understand this work. We should have listened to you from the start. I'm sorry we didn't. Doyle. She folded it back up. Tell him thank you, she said, and tell him the dogs were trying to tell everyone all along they didn't need an interpreter. They needed someone to stop talking long enough to listen. Burkett nodded. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape one left when it was held back. Come back, he said. Not officially. Just if you're in the area. I work 20 minutes away, she said. I know. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and held for a beat longer than a formal handshake. The kind of length that meant something without having to say what. She walked through the gate. She was back at Callaway Regional for her Tuesday shift 3 days later, in scrubs and sneakers, and the specific professional readiness of someone who had been doing this long enough that the emergency room didn't rattle her anymore. Pritchard had her assignment waiting. Bay 4, a wrist laceration, then a consult on a pediatric fever in Bay 8. She worked through the morning the way she always worked. Not brilliantly, not perfectly, with the everyday friction of a real emergency department where the equipment occasionally malfunctioned and the patients were sometimes difficult, and the paperwork was always more than there was time for. She made 2 decisions in the first hour that she second-guessed later, and one that she knew immediately was right. She held a 7-year-old's hand while a doctor sutured a forehead laceration and talked to the child about something completely unrelated to what was happening, because distraction was a legitimate medical technique, and it worked. She ate lunch standing up. At 2 in the afternoon, Pritchard stopped beside her at the nursing station. You okay? She said. It was a question Pritchard asked once in a while, not as small talk, as an actual inquiry. She was one of the few people Emily had worked with who meant it when she said it. Yeah, Emily said. And then, because it was Pritchard, it was a complicated week. I heard something went well at Iron Ridge. Emily looked at her. Where did you hear that? Hendricks called the department to say thank you. Pritchard raised an eyebrow. He's been discharged. He's going back to the unit. Emily absorbed this. He said specifically to find you and tell you. Pritchard paused. He also said the dogs are doing well. Emily turned back to her paperwork. She thought about Rex, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder on the first day. She thought about Dax sitting beside her on the last day, his flank warm against her leg, his breathing steady. She thought about Garst running a command sequence with wet eyes and a steady voice. She thought about the commendation letter folded in her jacket pocket at home, and the methodology document that would have her name on it, and Mercer standing at the kennel fence with a quality of honesty that had cost her something to produce. She thought about what it meant. Not the commendation, not the methodology, not any of the institutional acknowledgement that had come at the end and would fade eventually the way institutional acknowledgements always did. She thought about what it meant to walk into a space where every decision about you had already been made, where you'd been sorted into a category and the category had been dismissed, and to just keep working. To do the thing you actually knew how to do, quietly and specifically, until the thing you knew how to do became impossible to ignore. It wasn't heroic. She had no interest in that framing. She'd done her job. She'd done it carefully, and she'd done it in the right order, and she'd stayed in the room when it was easier to leave. The rest of it, the investigation, the charges, the commendation, that had happened because the evidence was clear, not because she was exceptional. The only exceptional thing, if there was one, was that she hadn't let the 5-minute dismissal at the gate change what she knew about herself. That was the thing that was actually hard. Not the kennels. Not Dax. Not the conference room with Voss. The hard thing was the gate, the crossed arms and the hospital badge and the assessment made before she'd said a word. The moment when someone looked at what you appeared to be and decided that was the whole of it. Most people, in that moment, started to agree with them. She never had. She didn't know exactly where that came from. Not from any clean story, not from any single lesson or person or defining moment. It was built from things that had happened to her, and things she'd chosen, and things she'd survived, and things she'd refused, and it was imperfect, and sometimes it cost her, and she was still working out what to do with it. But it was hers. And it was enough. She went back to work. Some people are dismissed because they don't fit the shape of what's expected. They're too quiet, or too young, or carrying the wrong credential in the wrong building. The world has a habit of deciding what something is before it looks carefully. The ones who survive that, who don't let the assumption become their answer, aren't the loudest or the most decorated. They're the ones who keep doing the work, who stay in the room, who understand that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong. The dogs knew it before anyone else did. They always do.